The summer of 1847 didn't just arrive in Louisiana, it haunted it. It was a season of wet heat and stagnant air, where the scent of blooming magnolia struggled to drown out the stench of the rot rising from the bayou. In the parish of St. Helena, the Beaumont estate stood like a bleached skull against the green horizon, a monument to a power built on the calculated breaking of human spirits. Governor Charles Beaumont owned the horizon, the 20,000 acres of white gold, and the 300 souls who bled to harvest it. But his most prized possession was his wife, Ella, a woman rendered in silk and pearls, a living trophy of Southern grace. To the world, she was a vision of aristocratic perfection. But beneath the corset and the practiced Sunday prayers, Ella was a woman buried alive. She was looking for a way to breathe. She found it in the eyes of a man the law called Property Item 47. This is not a story of a simple romance. It is a chronicle of a forbidden rebellion, a profane collision of two different cages, and the gathering storm that was about to wash the Beaumont Legacy away in blood. The Beaumont estate was a masterpiece of architectural cruelty, a white-columned monument that stood in stark defiance of the suffering that fueled its splendor. To the passing traveler, it appeared as a cathedral of Southern refinement, but to those within its shadow, it was a gilded tomb where the air tasted of stagnant humidity and old blood. Every marble tile in the grand foyer was a testament to Charles Beaumont's dominion, a cold surface that mirrored the hollow perfection of his wife, Ella. She walked those halls like a spirit, her silk skirts whispering against the stone, a prisoner of a social contract that valued her only as a decorative extension of her husband's political prestige. Her life was a series of choreographed movements, a performance of grace that masked a spirit slowly eroding under the weight of an agonizing, silent isolation. Outside the mansion's thick walls, the horizon was a jagged line of cotton fields where the sun acted as a relentless overseer, burning the world to a pale, dusty husk. Here, the geography of power was written in the dirt and the sweat of 300 souls who existed only as entries in a ledger. Elijah moved through this landscape as a ghost of his former self, his body a map of scars and labor that the law claimed as the governor's personal property. While Ella suffered behind lace curtains, Elijah endured the raw, visceral violence of the fields, yet both were united by a singular, crushing reality of ownership. Their existences were parallel lines of captivity, one defined by the soft suffocation of the parlor and the other by the brutal, physical grinding of the southern plantation. The contrast between the two worlds was a deliberate psychological weapon used to maintain a fragile order that relied on the absolute dehumanization of the occupied. Inside the house, the scent of expensive French perfumes clattered against the reality of the rot that seeped from the nearby swamps, a sensory metaphor for the Beaumont legacy. Charles Beaumont viewed his 20,000 acres and his blonde, elegant wife through the same lens of acquisition, seeing them as trophies that validated his place at the top of a decaying hierarchy. He did not see a woman or a man. He saw assets to be managed, manipulated, and discarded should they ever lose their shine or their utility to his ambition. This environment was a pressure cooker of resentment and quiet desperation, where the smallest spark of genuine human connection was viewed as an act of treason against the state. For Ella, the mansion was not a home but a sanctuary of silence where every word was measured and every smile was a lie told to keep the darkness at bay. She was surrounded by beauty, Italian chandeliers and imported furniture, yet she was starving for a single moment of authenticity in a world built entirely on the concept of transaction. Her gilded cage was constructed of expectations and etiquette, a prison that offered safety at the high cost of her soul's slow and agonizing expiration. She watched the world from her window with the eyes of a person who had already accepted her own death, never imagining that the key to her awakening lay in the hands of a man she was taught to ignore. This was the foundation of the ruin that was to come, a structural instability in the very heart of the Beaumont family's carefully constructed empire. Elijah's cage was made of iron and law, a far more lethal enclosure that offered no illusions of comfort or social standing to mitigate its inherent horror. He lived in the constant knowledge that his heartbeat belonged to another man, a reality that should have broken him but instead forged a terrifying, internal resilience. He moved through the world with a stoicism that was its own form of rebellion, refusing to let the machinery of the plantation grind away the memory of the man he used to be. The fields were his earthly grave, a place where hope was supposed to go to die, yet he carried his humanity like a hidden blade beneath his skin. It was in this intersection of two different types of property, the ornamental wife and the functional slave, that the true profanity of the Beaumont estate would finally be revealed and ultimately destroyed. The transformation of the Beaumont estate began not with a grand gesture, but in the dim, dust-moted silence of the working stables on a morning in late May. Eleanor had wandered past the manicured safety of her rose gardens, drawn by a restlessness that felt like a fever chill beneath her skin. The air inside the barn was heavy with the scent of hay, leather, and the primal warmth of livestock, a stark departure from the cloying perfumes of her parlor. In the center of the gloom stood Elijah, his frame backlit by the morning sun, working with a rhythmic precision that commanded the very air around him. He was shoeing a mare, his muscles rippling under skin the color of deep, rain-soaked earth, embodying a physical reality she had never been permitted to acknowledge. The world outside the stable doors seemed to vanish, leaving only the sound of his hammer and the sudden, violent racing of her own heart. When Elijah finally looked up, the social architecture of Louisiana crumbled for a fragment of time that felt like an eternity. He did not perform the practiced shuffle or the submissive downward glance that the law and the whip had spent centuries trying to instill in his blood. His eyes were dark, piercing, and terrifyingly clear, meeting her gaze with a level of recognition that stripped away her title, her silk, and her husband's name. In those 3 seconds, he saw her not as the governor's wife or a symbol of white Southern womanhood, but as a person equally haunted by a life she did not own. This was a moment of profound psychological trespassing, an unspoken dialogue that transcended the brutal hierarchy of the plantation and labeled them both as fugitives of the spirit. Elalina felt a sharp, agonizing crack in the armor she had worn since she was 17, a realization that her soul was not as dead as she had hoped. The silence was broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of the horse, a creature Elijah treated with a tenderness that seemed impossible in a world designed for destruction. He spoke to the animal in a low, resonant murmur, a voice that carried no trace of the degradation he was forced to endure every hour of his waking life. Elalina stood frozen, her lace-gloved hands trembling against the rough wood of the stall, mesmerized by the quiet strength that radiated from his every movement. She saw in him a humanity that the governor's ledgers could never quantify, a dignity that was not granted by status but forged in the fires of survival. The way he held himself, with a spine unbowed by the invisible chains of his status, made the opulence of her mansion seem like a collection of cheap, painted trinkets. This was the first time she had ever truly seen a man, and the sight of him made the vacuum of her own existence feel like a physical wound. "What is your name?" she asked, her voice a fragile sliver of sound that felt like both a prayer and a dangerous confession in the quiet of the barn. He did not look up again immediately, focusing his attention back on the horse's hoof, yet the air between them vibrated with the weight of the question. "Elijah, ma'am," he replied, and the sound of his name in the small space felt like a stone dropped into a deep, dark well of forgotten truths. To repeat it to herself was to acknowledge his personhood, an act of rebellion so absolute that it felt as though the very walls of the estate might collapse around them. She realized then that names were the first things stolen by the system, and by claiming his, he was reclaiming a part of the world she had been complicit in taking. She left the stables without another word, her heart thundering against her ribs like a trapped bird, terrified by the sudden, violent awakening of her own capacity to feel. That night, the memory of his gaze haunted her more than the governor's presence ever could, lingering in the shadows of her bedroom like an uninvited ghost. She lay awake staring at the canopy of her bed, seeing only those eyes that had refused to be owned or diminished by the crushing weight of his circumstances. Elijah, too, sat in the dark of his cabin, the phantom sensation of her presence lingering in his mind like the distant rolling thunder of an approaching storm. They had exchanged nothing but a glance and a name, Yet the foundation of the plantation's order had been irrevocably compromised by that single human interaction. The recognition of the human in one another was a profane act in the eyes of Louisiana law, a spark that had been struck in the dry tinder of their mutual desperation. From that morning forward, the stable was no longer just a place of labor. It was the site where the ruin of the Beaumonts had quietly, inevitably begun. The secret meetings in the rose garden became a ritual of quiet defiance, where the humid morning air served as a veil for their growing transgression. Elijah was often assigned to prune the sprawling bushes, his hands moving with a surgeon's care among the thorns, while Ella walked the paths under the guise of early morning exercise. Here, the rigid social hierarchies of the South were momentarily suspended, replaced by a fragile intimacy that grew in the spaces between whispered words and long, heavy silences. The garden was a masterpiece of controlled beauty, much like Ella herself, yet beneath the blooming petals lay the dark, damp earth of reality that they both finally began to share. They spoke of the rose's needs, of the soil and the seasons, but every sentence was a coded message about the struggle to survive in a climate that was inherently hostile to their growth. To the casual observer, it was a mistress instructing a servant. To the two of them, it was the only time they felt truly and dangerously alive. Elijah used the language of the garden to articulate a philosophy of survival that Ella had never encountered in her world of sheltered, aristocratic privilege. He taught her how a rose must be cut back to its core to thrive, a metaphor for the way he had been forced to prune his own heart to endure the loss of his family. He spoke of roots that reached deep into the dark to find water when the surface was parched, reflecting the hidden strength he had cultivated to maintain his dignity in chains. As he worked, he described the patience required to make something beautiful bloom in soil that was fundamentally depleted by greed and overexhaustion. Ella listened with a hunger that was almost physical, realizing that this man, whom the law labeled as an illiterate tool, possessed a wisdom far more profound than any of her husband's political peers. In his descriptions of the earth and the thorns, she heard the blueprint for her own awakening, a guide on how to exist within a cage without letting the spirit wither away. The confession of Elijah's past came like a sudden, chilling wind that stripped the romanticism from the garden and revealed the jagged bones of the plantation system. He told her of his wife, sold away to an Alabama ledger 7 years prior, and a daughter whose face was now only a fading ghost in the corners of his memory. This was not a story of tragedy to him. It was the standard currency of his life, a reality that Ella had spent 3 decades ignoring from behind her silk curtains. Hearing the specific human cost of her husband's wealth shattered the last of her delusions, making the scent of the magnolias suddenly smell like the rot of a fresh grave. She realized that the acceptable tragedies of her society were built upon the literal dismemberment of families, just like the one Elijah had once cherished and lost. The sorrow she felt was inadequate, a pale shadow of his enduring grief, yet the fact that she acknowledged it at all created a bridge across the uncrossable abyss between them. Ella responses were equally raw, shedding the layer of the governor's wife to reveal a woman who had been traded like a prize horse before she was old enough to know her own mind. She spoke of the suffocating emptiness of her mansion, where every room was filled with expensive artifacts but devoid of any warmth, purpose, or genuine human connection. To Elijah, her complaints could have seemed trivial compared to the whip, yet he recognized the same brand of ownership in her eyes that he felt on his own skin. He saw that she was a bird in a cage of gold while he was a beast in a cage of iron, but the bars were forged from the very same iron of the governor's unyielding will. This shared recognition of their status as property, one ornamental and one functional, forged a bond that was more than mere attraction. It was a desperate mutual recognition of their shared humanity. They were two captives whispering through the walls of their cells, finding a strange, forbidden solace in the fact that they were no longer suffering in total isolation. As July approached, their conversations deepened into a territory that was both sacred and profoundly profane by the standards of the 1847 Louisiana legal code. They moved beyond the metaphors of the garden to speak of freedom, not as a political concept or a destination on a map, but as a visceral internal state of being. Elijah described the memories of his childhood before the first auction block, the taste of food grown on his own terms and the sound of his mother's voice unburdened by fear. Elalina found herself imagining a world where she was not a symbol or a trophy, but a woman who could choose her own path and speak her own mind without fear of social exile. These dreams were more dangerous than any weapon, for they gave them a reason to resent the chains they had previously accepted as the natural order of the world. The Rose Garden had become a laboratory of revolution, where two souls were being reconstructed in a way that made their continued existence in the Beaumont estate an impossibility. The atmosphere of the Beaumont estate shifted from a stagnant heat to a prickly, electric tension as the eyes of the powerful began to narrow. Thaddeus Cole, the overseer whose very name was synonymous with the crack of a lash, started appearing like a predatory shadow wherever Elalina walked. He was a man who made his living by reading the subtle shifts in the body language of the oppressed, and he sensed a new, dangerous frequency in the air. Cole's presence was a physical manifestation of the system's surveillance, a reminder that on a plantation, there is no such thing as a private conversation or a hidden thought. He moved Elijah to the farthest reaches of the property, assigning him the most backbreaking labor under a sun that seemed to conspire with the overseer's cruelty. This strategic separation was not merely a logistical change, but a psychological war intended to remind both the mistress and the slave of their respective boundaries. Inside the mansion, the governor's observation of his wife took on the cold, analytical quality of a man inspecting a malfunctioning piece of machinery. Charles Beaumont was a creature of absolute control, and the sudden, unexplained glow in Elalina's eyes struck him as a profound act of domestic insubordination. He began to ask casual, leading questions during their stiff, formal dinners, his voice a smooth blade that sought the soft tissue of her hidden secrets. He noticed the way she lingered by the windows that overlooked the quarters and how her laughter, once entirely absent, now emerged in strange, solitary moments. To Charles, a happy wife was only acceptable if he was the sole architect of that happiness, and any joy he did not grant was a theft. His suspicion was not born of love or jealousy, but of a deep-seated need to protect his investment from the invisible rot of independence. The house servants, existing as the silent witnesses to the estate's inner workings, moved through the halls with a heightened sense of collective dread. They saw the way the governor's gaze tracked Elalina's every movement, and they heard the hushed, urgent consultations between Beaumont and his overseer in the late hours. Mama Seraphine, the kitchen's matriarch, recognized the signs of an impending storm that would likely drench the entire community in a fresh coat of blood. She had seen this pattern before, the reckless hope of a white woman colliding with the lethal reality of a black man's existence in the deep South. The servants knew that when the master's house caught fire, it was the quarters that burned to the ground, and their prayers became a desperate shield against the inevitable. They began to distance themselves from the garden, fearful that even the act of witnessing could be interpreted as a form of complicity in the coming disaster. The psychological pressure on Elijah reached a breaking point as Cole's harassment transformed from general malice into a specific, targeted campaign of physical and mental exhaustion. Every day brought a new, impossible task and a fresh set of threats delivered in the overseer's low, menacing drawl that never quite reached a shout. Elijah understood that he was being baited into a reaction, an outburst of spirit that would give Cole the legal and social permission to extinguish him entirely. He carried the weight of the governor's suspicion in the set of his shoulders, knowing that his life now hung by a thread thinner than the silk of Elalina's dresses. He saw the way the other field hands looked at him, with a mixture of pity and a terrifying, distant fear, as if he were already a man walking toward a waiting noose. Despite the mounting danger, the memory of the Rose Garden remained his only sanctuary, a mental fortress that the overseer's whip could not yet penetrate. As the end of July approached, the surveillance of the Beaumont estate became an airtight enclosure that allowed for no more secret walks or whispered exchanges. The governor had essentially placed Elalina under a form of elegant house arrest, filling her schedule with social obligations and constant accompaniment that served as a velvet-lined prison. Every letter she didn't write and every glance she couldn't steal felt like a slow suffocation, a return to the numb death she had briefly managed to escape. The tension between the mansion and the fields was a physical force, a heavy, unbreathable weight that signaled the end of their brief and beautiful period of denial. They were no longer just two souls finding a connection. They were two targets moving through the crosshairs of a system that thrived on the total destruction of such anomalies. The fourth keynote ends here, with the predator's jaws open and the inevitable catastrophe beginning to take its final, terrifying shape. The silence imposed by the governor's surveillance forced their rebellion into the dangerous realm of the written word, turning ink and paper into instruments of high treason. Ella spent her nights in the flickering glow of a single candle, her hand trembling as she poured her forbidden reality into letters she knew could be her death warrant. She wrote with a feverish honesty that she had never dared to speak aloud, confessing that she had been a hollow shell until the moment their eyes met in the stables. These pages were more than just messages. They were the mapping of a soul that had finally decided to choose the agony of feeling over the safety of numbness. Each stroke of the pen was a rhythmic heartbeat of defiance, a desperate attempt to bridge the physical abyss that Charles Beaumont had widened between the mansion and the fields. By committing her thoughts to paper, she was crossing the final threshold, moving from a silent, internal yearning to an external act of revolutionary consequence. The young chambermaid Dinah became the invisible artery through which this life-threatening correspondence flowed, moving through the estate like a ghost that the white world refused to see. She accepted the letters with a face of stone, hiding the folded paper deep within the layers of her apron while navigating the treacherous hallways of the mansion. Dinah understood better than anyone that her own life was now tied to the survival of these secrets, a burden that made every floorboard's creak sound like a sudden, violent accusation. She moved between the two worlds with a general's precision, calculating the movements of Thaddeus Cole and the governor to find the brief, shaded moments where the letters could change hands. This was the quiet, terrifying labor of the oppressed, where a teenager held the power to either ignite a tragedy or preserve a flicker of human dignity against the dark. Her involvement highlighted the interconnectedness of their fates, showing how one woman's search for meaning placed an entire community in the direct path of the governor's inevitable wrath. When Elijah received the letters, the touch of the paper felt like a scorching coal against his skin, a physical connection to a woman he was forbidden to even imagine. He read her words by the dim, dying embers of his cabin's hearth, his eyes tracing the loops of her handwriting as if they were a map to a world he would never inhabit. Her confessions of loneliness and her recognition of his humanity acted as a balm to the scars on his back, yet they also served as a terrifying confirmation of his impending doom. He realized that for Ella this was a romantic awakening, but for a man in his position, it was a beautiful, inescapable path toward the gallows or the fire. Every word she wrote about choosing the hurt over the numbness echoed the very philosophy of survival he had spent his entire life trying to suppress for the sake of staying alive. The letters transformed his exhaustion into a sharp, crystalline clarity, making him realize that he was no longer just an item of property, but a man who was loved. The letters eventually moved beyond simple longing, becoming a manifesto for two caged souls who had decided that the price of their survival was simply too high to pay. They began to speak of a freedom that was not found in geography, but in the reckless act of belonging to oneself even if only for a fleeting, stolen moment in time. Ella writing grew bolder as the heat of August intensified, her prose shedding the polite constraints of her upbringing to embrace a raw, visceral demand for a life of her own choosing. Elijah found himself answering in his mind with a fierceness that matched her own, preparing himself for the moment when the hidden truth would inevitably collide with the governor's unyielding power. They were no longer just a mistress and a slave. They were two co-conspirators in a war against a social order that demanded the total annihilation of their shared, forbidden humanity. The point of no return was not a single event, but the slow, steady accumulation of these written truths that made a return to their previous lives an absolute impossibility. The final letter arrived as the August storm clouds began to gather on the horizon, thick and heavy with the promise of a cleansing, destructive rain. It was a message of ultimate surrender to the feeling they had cultivated, an acknowledgment that they would rather face the consequences of their truth than continue the lie of their existence. The atmosphere of the Beaumont estate was now a tinderbox, waiting for the single spark of discovery that would set the entire legacy of the parish into a permanent, roaring blaze. Charles Beaumont and Thaddeus Cole were closing in, their patience exhausted and their suspicion hardened into a lethal certainty that demanded a public and brutal resolution. The fifth keynote concludes as the paper is tucked away for the last time, and the two protagonists stand on the precipice of a ruin that they have actively and knowingly chosen for themselves. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was the very air they breathed, and the first strike of lightning was already beginning to descend upon the white columns of the mansion.